You won't believe what happened when everyone thought they knew exactly who this blonde recruit was. What seemed like just another pretty face trying to play soldier turned into something that would save hundreds of lives and change everything these hardened military men believed about judging people by their appearance. This story will make you question every assumption you've ever made about someone based on how they look. But more than that, it will show you how dangerous our prejudices can be and how true courage sometimes means allowing yourself to be completely misunderstood while never losing sight of who you really are. I've been in the Navy for over 2 decades now. I've witnessed the transformation of thousands of young men and women who walked through those gates carrying nothing but dreams, fears, and untested potential. Some arrive with swagger and confidence that crumbles like sandcastles at the first sign of real challenge. Others come in looking lost and uncertain, but discover reserves of strength and character they never knew they possessed. Still others surprise everyone, including themselves, by revealing capabilities that no one could have predicted based on their appearance or background. After all these years of watching human nature unfold under the pressures of military training, I thought I could read people pretty well. I thought I understood what made a good sailor and what didn't. I thought I could spot the ones who would thrive and the ones who would wash out within the first few weeks. I thought I knew how to separate genuine potential from wishful thinking, real character from carefully constructed facades. I was wrong about a lot of things during my career, but I was never more spectacularly wrong than I was about Sarah Mitchell. It was a Tuesday morning in early September when she first walked through those imposing steel gates of Naval Station Norfolk. The morning mist was still hanging low over the harbour like a grey blanket, clinging to the water and wrapping around the massive hulls of the ships that dominated the skyline. The mist gave everything an ethereal quality, as if the entire base existed in some liminal space between the ordinary world and something far more significant. The massive ships loomed in the distance like sleeping giants waiting to be awakened, destroyers and cruisers and aircraft carriers that represented some of the most advanced military technology in the world. Their grey hulls stretched for hundreds of feet, bristling with radar arrays, missile systems, and communication equipment that connected them to a global network of naval power projection. The sight never failed to inspire awe, even in someone like me who had seen it thousands of times before. The air carried that distinctive smell that every sailor knows by heart. A mixture of salt water, diesel fuel, metal, and something indefinable that speaks to purpose, to power, to a life dedicated to something bigger than yourself. It's the scent of duty, of sacrifice, of young people choosing to serve their country in one of the most demanding and dangerous professions in the world. Sarah stepped off that government-issued bus with her regulation duffel bag slung over her shoulder, moving with the careful precision of someone who understood that first impressions mattered and was determined to make a good one. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail that met military grooming standards, while somehow still managing to catch what little sunlight filtered through the Virginia clouds. Even in the standard-issue civilian clothes that all new recruits wore on their first day, there was something about her that commanded attention. But it wasn't just because she was obviously attractive, though she certainly was that. There was something in the way she moved, the way she observed everything around her that suggested depths that weren't immediately apparent. She wasn't gawking like a tourist seeing military hardware for the first time, nor was she trying to project false confidence to mask her nervousness. She was moving with purpose, but also with curiosity, her head turning slightly as she took in the details of her new environment with the focused attention of someone who understood that details mattered. I was watching from the drill instructor's tower, as I always did when new recruits arrived. It was part of my job to assess them from the moment they set foot on base, to try to identify potential problems, natural leaders, or those who might not make it through the first week of training. After 23 years in the Navy, You develop an instinct for these things that goes beyond conscious analysis. You learn to read body language, to spot the telltale signs of someone who's in over their head, or someone who might have what it takes to wear the uniform with honor. From my elevated position, I could see Sarah making her way across the compound with deliberate, measured steps that spoke to careful consideration and self-control. She wasn't rushing like some recruits did, driven by nervous energy and the fear of being late on their first day. She wasn't dragging her feet like others who were already regretting their decision to enlist and were moving as slowly as possible toward their new reality. She was moving with purpose, but also with an analytical quality that suggested she was already beginning to understand the environment she was entering. The massive grey hulls of destroyers and cruisers dominated the harbour, their superstructures bristling with radar arrays, missile launchers, and communication equipment that represented billions of dollars worth of the most advanced military technology in the world. Sailors in working uniforms moved with practiced efficiency across the decks and along the piers, each one a small but essential part of a vast machine dedicated to protecting American interests around the globe. The sound of diesel engines provided a constant low rumble that you felt as much as heard. Power tools created a percussion section as maintenance crews worked on everything from hull repairs to electronic systems upgrades. Shouted commands and radio chatter added a human element to the symphony of productive activity that never truly stopped at a naval base. Even at night, even during supposed downtime, there was always something happening. Always someone working to maintain the readiness that naval operations demanded. Sarah was studying all of it, I noticed. Not gawking like someone who'd never seen military equipment before, but observing with the focused attention of someone who understood that everything she was seeing would soon become part of her daily life. There was something almost analytical about the way she looked at things, as if she was making mental notes about systems and procedures and filing them away for future reference. She paused for a moment near the main pier, watching a crew of sailors performing routine maintenance on one of the destroyers. They were working on what appeared to be a complex electronic system with cables and diagnostic equipment spread across the deck in organized patterns that spoke to careful planning and systematic troubleshooting. Most new recruits would have seen nothing more than a group of people working on complicated-looking equipment. Sarah seemed to be observing specific details about their procedures, the way they communicated with each other, the systematic approach they were taking to their task. But the other recruits weren't noticing any of that. They noticed her immediately, of course. How could they not? In a group of 37 new arrivals, mostly men, mostly young, mostly carrying themselves with the uncertain bravado of people trying to prove they belonged somewhere they'd never been before, Sarah stood out like a lighthouse beacon cutting through fog. But what they saw wasn't what I was seeing from my position in the tower. Where I noticed careful observation and quiet confidence, they saw something entirely different. They saw an easy target. "Look what the Navy sent us," I heard Johnson mutter to his buddy Rodriguez as they watched her from across the assembly yard. Johnson was a thick-set kid from a small town in Ohio, the kind of recruit who'd probably been the tough guy in his high school and was looking to re-establish that identity in his new environment. He had the broad shoulders and calloused hands of someone who'd worked physical jobs, probably construction or factory work, and he carried himself with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd learned to use his size and strength to get what he wanted. "Barbie's decided to play dress-up as a sailor," Johnson continued, his voice carrying just enough volume for several other recruits to hear and laugh along with his observation. There was something particularly ugly in his tone, a combination of sexual objectification and professional dismissal that suggested he saw Sarah not as a fellow recruit facing the same challenges he was, but as some kind of foreign intrusion into what he considered his rightful domain. Rodriguez laughed, but it wasn't a kind sound. Rodriguez had that lean, hungry look of someone who'd grown up fighting for everything he'd ever gotten. and he seemed to view every interaction as a potential competition where someone had to win and someone had to lose. He was from East LA, had probably seen more violence and hardship in his 18 years than most people experience in a lifetime, and he'd learned to establish dominance quickly in new situations as a matter of survival. "Give her a week," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty that young men sometimes mistake for wisdom. "2, if she's really stubborn. These pretty girls always think military life is going to be some kind of adventure, like something they saw in a movie, until they actually have to do the work. Then reality hits and they're crying for mommy and daddy to come pick them up." Around them, other recruits were having similar conversations, forming the kind of instant social hierarchies that emerge whenever groups of young people are thrown together in unfamiliar circumstances. Thompson, a lanky farm boy from Kansas with the kind of rural background that often produces excellent soldiers, was shaking his head with the kind of righteous disapproval that comes from believing you've earned something that others haven't. "I don't get why they even let them in," Thompson was saying to anyone who would listen. "This isn't a game. Lives depend on every person doing their job right, especially in combat situations. You can't have weak links in the chain just because politicians want to look progressive and inclusive. The military isn't supposed to be a social experiment." Martinez, who'd been quiet up until then, nodded his agreement with the fervor of someone who'd found validation for opinions he'd been carrying, but hadn't expressed. Martinez was the son of immigrants, had worked 2 jobs to help support his family while finishing high school, and had joined the Navy partly out of patriotism and partly because he needed the education benefits to have any chance of going to college. "My cousin was in the Marines," Martinez said, his voice carrying the authority of second-hand military experience. "He told me stories about what happens when people can't pull their weight in real situations. Other people die. That's the reality of military service that these diversity hires don't understand. When you're in combat, when lives are on the line, you need to know that every person next to you is going to be able to do their job." Wilson, standing nearby, was nodding along while contributing his own observations. Wilson was from a military family. His father had been Navy, his grandfather had been Army, and he'd grown up with very specific ideas about what military service meant and who was suited for it. "It's not fair to the rest of us," he said. "We're all here because we want to serve our country, because we're willing to make sacrifices and do whatever it takes. Then they bring in people who are obviously just here for the benefits or because they think it'll look good on their resume." Davis, who'd been listening to all of this with growing enthusiasm, jumped in with his own contribution. "You can just tell by looking at her that she's never done a day of real work in her life," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone making pronouncements about things he knew nothing about. "Probably grew up in some suburb where the biggest challenge she ever faced was deciding which car Daddy was going to buy her for her birthday." The conversation continued in this vein, with each participant adding their own assumptions and prejudices to the growing narrative about Sarah Mitchell. They were creating a complete fictional biography for her, based on nothing more than her appearance and their own insecurities about their place in this new environment. She was spoiled, privileged, weak, naive, unsuited for military service, and probably not even genuinely committed to serving her country. I'd heard this conversation before, countless times over my career. Every time the military opened its doors a little wider, every time we recognized that strength and courage came in forms that didn't match the traditional stereotype, there was always resistance. There were always people who confused familiarity with competence, who believed that looking like everyone else was somehow more important than being able to do the job. Usually, these conversations were just noise, the grumbling of people who would eventually learn better once they saw what their fellow service members were actually capable of. The military has a way of burning away prejudices and assumptions through the simple expedient of shared hardship and mutual dependence. When you're tired, cold, scared, and depending on the person next to you to help you get through whatever challenge you're facing, you tend to care a lot more about their competence and character than their background or appearance. But as I watched the group dynamics forming around Sarah Mitchell, I had a feeling this situation might be different. There was something particularly vicious in the way some of these recruits were already dismissing her, something that went beyond the usual hazing and testing that all new arrivals endured. This felt personal in a way that suggested it might not resolve itself through the normal processes of military training. Part of it was undoubtedly sexual. Young men in an environment where they were feeling insecure and challenged were channeling their frustrations into hostility towards someone they perceived as different and therefore threatening to their sense of identity. Part of it was class-based. Several of these recruits clearly came from backgrounds where they'd had to work hard for everything they'd achieved, and they resented what they assumed was Sarah's privileged upbringing. But there was also something deeper and more troubling at work. These young men were defining their own worth, partly by their membership in what they saw as an exclusive club. And Sarah's presence seemed to challenge the exclusivity that made their membership valuable to them. If military service was something that anyone could do, including someone who looked like Sarah, then what did that say about their own accomplishments? Sarah, for her part, seemed completely unaware of the conversations happening around her. Or maybe she was aware and simply chose not to acknowledge them. She'd found her assigned position in the formation and was standing at attention with the same focused composure I'd noticed earlier. Her posture was correct without being stiff, alert without being anxious. She looked like someone who was exactly where she belonged, regardless of what anyone else thought about her presence there. That composure would be tested soon enough, and in ways that would reveal the true character of everyone involved. Chief Petty Officer Williams emerged from the administrative building like a force of nature, his presence immediately commanding the attention of every recruit in the yard. Williams was a man who'd spent more years in the Navy than most of these kids had been alive, and every day of that service showed in the way he carried himself. He had the weathered look of someone who'd served on ships in every ocean, who'd faced storms and emergencies and the 1,000 daily challenges that came with life at sea. Williams had salt and pepper hair that he kept cut to regulation length, steel grey eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and the kind of bearing that commanded respect without having to demand it. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, and his very presence communicated decades of experience and competence that couldn't be faked or learned from books. He also had a reputation throughout the base for his ability to identify and eliminate recruits who didn't have what it took to serve. It wasn't cruelty exactly, though it could certainly feel that way to the people on the receiving end. It was more like a quality control process, a way of ensuring that only people who could truly handle the responsibilities of naval service made it through to active duty. Williams believed deeply in the importance of military standards, not as arbitrary rules designed to make people's lives difficult, but as essential safeguards that protected both individual sailors and the missions they were called upon to complete. He'd seen what happened when standards were relaxed or when people were advanced through training who shouldn't have been, and he was determined not to let that happen on his watch. He'd taken one look at Sarah during the initial formation, and I could practically see the wheels turning in his head. Here was someone who didn't fit his template of what a sailor should look like. Someone whose presence seemed to challenge his fundamental assumptions about military readiness and capability. Everything about his body language suggested that he'd already made up his mind about her suitability for naval service. "Mitchell!" he barked, his voice carrying across the entire training ground with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Front and center!" Sarah stepped forward without hesitation, breaking from the formation with the crisp precision of someone who'd been practicing military movements and understood the importance of executing them correctly. Her face remained calm and focused as she approached Williams, showing none of the nervous energy that most recruits displayed when they were singled out for attention on their first day. "So you think you can handle Navy life, do you, recruit?" Williams began circling her like a predator sizing up prey, his voice carrying just enough volume for the other recruits to hear every word. This wasn't just about Sarah, it was a performance designed to establish his authority and send a message to everyone present about what he expected from them. "You think because they changed the rules to let pretty little girls play with the big boys, that somehow makes you qualified to serve on a United States Navy vessel," Williams continued, his tone carrying layers of meaning that went far beyond the literal content of his words. He was questioning not just Sarah's individual qualifications, but the entire concept of women serving in combat roles. The question hung in the air like a challenge, loaded with assumptions and expectations that went far beyond military protocol. This wasn't just about Sarah's ability to complete basic training. It was about everything Williams believed about strength, about capability, about who belonged in his Navy and who didn't. "Yes, Chief Petty Officer," Sarah replied, her voice steady and clear, carrying none of the defiance or defensiveness that such a question might have provoked in someone else. Her tone was respectful but not submissive, confident but not arrogant. "Yes, Chief Petty Officer," Williams mimicked, his tone dripping with sarcasm as he raised his voice to an exaggerated falsetto that drew chuckles from some of the watching recruits. "Well, aren't you confident? Tell me, Mitchell, what makes you think you belong here? What special skills do you bring to my Navy? What have you done in your comfortable civilian life that prepares you for the realities of military service?" The questions came rapid fire, each one designed to provoke a reaction that would justify the treatment Williams clearly intended to subject her to. He was looking for signs of entitlement, defensiveness, or the kind of privileged background that he assumed someone like Sarah must have come from. And here's where it got interesting, where Sarah Mitchell first revealed the kind of person she really was. Most recruits in that situation would have responded in one of two predictable ways. Either they would have tried to prove themselves by listing their qualifications, their high school achievements, their athletic accomplishments, desperately trying to convince Williams that they deserved to be there. Or they would have crumbled under the pressure, stammering out some defensive response that only confirmed Williams' suspicions about their unsuitability for military life. Sarah did neither. "I'm here to serve, Chief Petty Officer," she said simply, her voice carrying quiet conviction that couldn't be mistaken for anything other than genuine commitment. Same as everyone else. It was a perfect non-answer, neither boastful nor submissive. It acknowledged Williams' authority while refusing to accept the premise of his question, that she needed to justify her presence in a way that the male recruits didn't. It was diplomatically respectful while being quietly defiant, and it clearly wasn't what Williams had expected to hear. For just a moment, Williams paused, as if he was recalibrating his approach. His experience had taught him to expect certain reactions from recruits under pressure, and Sarah's response didn't fit any of the categories he was familiar with. Then his expression hardened, and I knew that Sarah Mitchell had just earned herself a level of scrutiny that would make the next several weeks extremely difficult. "We'll see about that, recruit," Williams said, his voice dropping to a tone that every military person recognizes as trouble. "We'll see if you're still singing the same tune when you've had a taste of what real military service actually requires. We'll see if that pretty little smile stays in place when you're faced with challenges that can't be solved with charm and good looks." What followed was the beginning of what would become a daily ritual of extra drills, additional duties, and impossible standards that seemed designed specifically to break Sarah's spirit and prove Williams' point about her unsuitability for naval service. Williams assigned her to KP duty twice as often as anyone else, claiming that she needed extra practice with the kind of menial tasks that formed the backbone of military life. Her bunk had to be made to standards that no one could consistently achieve, with sheets so tight you could bounce a quarter off them, and every item of clothing folded to measurements that required a ruler to verify. When she achieved those impossible standards, Williams would find microscopic flaws that justified making her start over. Her uniforms had to be pressed to perfection that would have impressed a Marine dress parade, with every crease sharp enough to cut paper and every button polished to mirror brightness. Her boots had to shine like black glass, reflecting light with the kind of perfection that took hours of careful work to achieve. Her equipment had to be cleaned and organized in ways that went far beyond regulation requirements. Her rifle had to be stripped, cleaned, and reassembled to standards that exceeded what was expected of anyone else. Her gear had to be arranged in patterns that were both functional and aesthetically perfect, as if she was preparing for inspection by visiting dignitaries rather than routine training exercises. But here's the thing about Sarah Mitchell that nobody understood yet. She didn't break easily. Over the following days and weeks, I watched as she endured every humiliation, every extra assignment, every impossible standard with the same calm determination she'd shown that first day. When Williams found fault with her perfectly made bunk and ordered her to strip it and start over, she did it without complaint or visible frustration. When he assigned her to scrub the bathroom floors with a toothbrush because he claimed to have found a microscopic spot on her rifle, she completed the task thoroughly and professionally. When he made her run extra laps around the training ground because her hair was allegedly out of regulation, even though it met every published standard, she ran them without protest. When he assigned her to kitchen duty during her supposed free time, claiming that she needed to learn the value of hard work, she reported promptly and performed every task to the best of her ability, and the other recruits noticed. At first, they were entertained by Sarah's treatment. It confirmed their assumptions about her unsuitability for military life, and it gave them someone to look down on, which made them feel better about their own struggles with the demands of training. Watching someone else be singled out for harassment also served the psychological function of making them feel safer. As long as Williams was focused on Sarah, he wasn't looking for reasons to make their lives difficult. They started calling her Princess behind her back, sometimes even to her face, making exaggerated courtesy gestures when she walked by. They would bow and pretend to tip their caps like she was royalty visiting from another world, putting on elaborate displays of mock deference that were designed to humiliate rather than honor. "How's life in the palace, Princess?" Johnson would ask when she sat down in the mess hall, his voice loud enough for everyone at nearby tables to hear. "Getting tired of roughing it with us common folk. Maybe you should call Daddy and ask him to send the chauffeur to pick you up." Rodriguez would laugh and add his own commentary, building on Johnson's theme with increasingly elaborate insults. "Maybe we should get her some silk sheets for her bunk. These military-issue blankets are probably too rough for her delicate skin. I bet she's never slept on anything that wasn't made of Egyptian cotton." Thompson would shake his head with mock sympathy, pretending to be concerned about Sarah's welfare while actually enjoying her discomfort. "It's really not fair to her, you know. She probably thought this was going to be like one of those movies where the pretty girl shows up and everyone falls all over themselves to help her. Reality's got to be pretty disappointing when you're used to having everything handed to you." Martinez would contribute his own observations, drawing on his immigrant family's experience to add weight to his criticism. "My parents worked 3 jobs to give me the chance to be here," he would say. "They sacrificed everything so I could serve my country. It's insulting to them when people like her show up thinking they deserve the same opportunities without putting in the same effort." Sarah never responded to any of it. She would continue eating her meal or cleaning her equipment or whatever task she was performing, showing no sign that she even heard the comments. This lack of reaction seemed to frustrate some of the recruits, who had expected their harassment to provoke some kind of emotional response that would justify their behavior and provide them with the satisfaction of seeing her break down. But her silence also made some of them more creative and more vicious in their cruelty. Martinez started accidentally bumping into her during formation, claiming afterward that he hadn't seen her there and apologizing with exaggerated politeness that fooled no one. The bumps were always hard enough to knock her off balance, but not so obvious that they couldn't be dismissed as accidents. Wilson would hold doors just long enough for her to approach, then let them slam shut in her face, apologizing with mock surprise and offering to help her with whatever she was carrying. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you were there. Here, let me get that for you," he would say, his tone dripping with false sincerity. Davis would knock her equipment off tables and shelves, then express surprise and offer to help her pick it up, as if his clumsiness was genuine rather than deliberate. "Whoops, sorry about that. These tables are so crowded, aren't they? Let me help you with that stuff." Deal. Thompson developed a habit of standing just close enough to her in line to make her uncomfortable, invading her personal space in ways that were subtle enough to avoid official notice, but obvious enough to create psychological pressure. When she would step away, he would follow, maintaining the uncomfortable proximity while pretending to be unaware of what he was doing. Rodriguez took to making loud comments about her appearance whenever she was within earshot, discussing her physical attributes with other recruits as if she wasn't present or wasn't a fellow human being deserving of basic respect. "I wonder if she works out," he would say. "She's got that gym membership body, you know. Probably spends more on personal trainers than most people make in a month." Through all of this, Sarah maintained the same steady composure that had characterized her behavior since the first day. She would clean up spilled equipment without comment or complaint. She would arrive at destinations despite doors being slammed in her face, finding alternative routes or simply opening the doors herself. She would maintain her position in formation despite being deliberately bumped and jostled, adjusting her stance but never retaliating or calling attention to what was happening. Her refusal to be provoked seemed to only make her tormentors more determined to find her breaking point. They escalated their tactics, becoming more obvious in their harassment while still trying to maintain plausible deniability if questioned by instructors. Johnson started leaving her personal items in places where they would get dirty or damaged, then expressing mock concern when she discovered them. "Oh no! How did your stuff end up in the mud? That's terrible. Someone should be more careful with their belongings." Wilson began spreading rumors about her background and motivations, creating elaborate stories about her supposed privileged upbringing and sharing them with anyone who would listen. According to Wilson, Sarah was the daughter of a wealthy defense contractor who had connections in Washington that had guaranteed her acceptance into the Navy regardless of her qualifications. Davis took to making loud predictions about how long she would last, taking bets from other recruits about when she would finally give up and request a transfer. "I give her 2 more weeks," he would announce. 3 at the outside. You can see it in her eyes. She's already thinking about how to get out of here without losing face. The psychological pressure was intense, and it was constant. It wasn't just the official harassment from Williams, though that continued daily and seemed to be getting worse as he became frustrated by her failure to break down under his impossible standards. It was the knowledge that she was surrounded by people who were actively rooting for her failure, who saw her success as somehow diminishing their own worth, who had decided that she didn't belong and were willing to make her life miserable to prove their point. Most people would have broken under that kind of sustained pressure. Most people would have either lashed out in anger, providing their tormentors with the emotional response they were seeking and justifying their treatment of her, or would have simply given up and requested a transfer or discharge. The military has procedures for dealing with people who can't handle the stress of service, and no one would have blamed Sarah for using them. The smart thing to do, from a purely practical standpoint, would have been to reveal her background and qualifications, to use her credentials to stop the harassment and gain the respect that her expertise deserved. A simple conversation with Williams about her civilian experience would have ended the impossible standards and extra duties immediately. A casual mention of her educational background would have shut down the recruit's assumptions about her privileged upbringing and lack of work ethic. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't interested in taking the easy way out. And that's when I started to realize that maybe these recruits had picked the wrong person to underestimate, and that this situation was going to end very differently than anyone expected. It began with small things, details that most people wouldn't notice unless they were specifically looking for them and knew what to look for. During weapons training, while other recruits struggled to field strip and reassemble their M16 rifles within the required time limits, consulting instruction manuals and asking for clarification about procedures, Sarah's hands moved with a precision and confidence that suggested she'd performed these tasks many times before. She didn't need to refer to the instruction manual or ask for clarification about the sequence of operations. Her movements were smooth and efficient, almost automatic, as if the rifle's components were as familiar to her as the features of her own face. She could strip the weapon down to its basic components, clean each part thoroughly, and reassemble it in a fraction of the time required by most recruits. During navigation exercises, she seemed to instinctively understand concepts that took other recruits weeks to grasp. When the instructor explained how to use celestial navigation to determine position at sea, a skill that had been critical for centuries before the advent of electronic systems, Sarah was nodding along and asking follow-up questions that showed she understood not just the basic principles, but some of the more advanced applications and potential complications. When they practiced using GPS systems and electronic navigation tools, she was able to troubleshoot problems that stumped other recruits and even some of the instructors. She seemed to understand the underlying principles that made the technology work, rather than just memorizing the button sequences required to operate the equipment. Most telling of all, during the technical systems overview sessions, dry, complex lectures about ship operations that usually had half the recruits fighting to stay awake, Sarah was taking detailed notes and asking questions that demonstrated a level of understanding that went far beyond what basic training was supposed to provide. She would ask about redundant safety systems, wondering why certain critical functions had multiple backup systems while others relied on single points of failure. She would inquire about backup procedures for electronic failures, showing interest in how crews would maintain operations if their primary systems were damaged or compromised. She would ask about the integration between different ship systems, demonstrating understanding of how failures in one area could cascade into problems throughout the vessel. These weren't the questions of someone trying to impress instructors with superficial knowledge. These were the questions of someone who understood complex systems and was genuinely interested in how they worked and how they could fail. But none of the other recruits noticed these things. They were too busy being entertained by their own cruelty, too focused on confirming their preconceptions about Sarah's incompetence, to pay attention to what was actually happening right in front of them. They noticed when Williams made her redo tasks that she'd already completed perfectly. They noticed when she was assigned extra duties that kept her working long after everyone else had finished for the day. They noticed when she was subjected to standards and expectations that no one else had to meet. But they didn't notice that she was meeting those standards consistently and efficiently. They didn't notice that she was completing those extra duties thoroughly and professionally, often finishing them faster than Williams had expected. They didn't notice that despite all the additional pressure and harassment, her performance in actual training exercises was consistently excellent. They were so invested in the narrative of her inevitable failure that they couldn't see the evidence of her competence that was right in front of them. They had decided who Sarah Mitchell was based on her appearance and their own prejudices, and no amount of contrary evidence was going to change their minds. This kind of cognitive bias is more common than most people realize. Once we've formed an opinion about someone, we tend to interpret all subsequent information in ways that confirm our initial judgment. Evidence that contradicts our assumptions is either ignored, dismissed as irrelevant, or reinterpreted to fit our existing narrative. In Sarah's case, her consistent performance was attributed to luck, to the tasks being easier than they appeared, or to favoritism from instructors who were supposedly going easy on her because of her gender. Her calm demeanor under pressure was interpreted as evidence that she didn't understand the seriousness of the situation, rather than as a sign of her emotional maturity and self-control. The turning point came during what the Navy calls Hell Week. 5 days of intensive training designed to push every recruit to their absolute physical, mental, and emotional limits. It's a pressure cooker environment where sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, and mental stress combine to strip away all the pretenses and facades that people use to hide their true character. The concept behind Hell Week is simple but brutal. Put people under extreme stress and see what remains when all the superficial layers are burned away. Some recruits discover reserves of strength and determination they never knew they possessed. Others discover that they've been overestimating their own capabilities, and they wash out rather than continue with training that's revealed their limitations. Most fall somewhere in between, struggling through the week with varying degrees of success and learning important lessons about their own capacity for endurance. The physical challenges are significant but manageable for anyone in reasonable physical condition. Long runs, obstacle courses, calisthenics sessions that seem to go on forever, and combat simulations that test both individual skills and team coordination. The mental challenges are more subtle but equally important. Complex problem-solving exercises under time pressure, navigation challenges that require both technical knowledge and practical judgment, and leadership scenarios that rotate responsibility among different recruits. But the real test is psychological. Can you maintain your composure when you're exhausted and stressed? Can you work effectively with people who are just as tired and frustrated as you are? Can you make good decisions when you're operating on minimal sleep and maximum adrenaline? Can you persist in the face of challenges that seem designed to make you give up? By day 3 of Hell Week, we'd already lost 2 recruits. Peterson, a kid from Montana who'd seemed like a natural fit for military life, had requested immediate discharge rather than continue with training that was revealing psychological vulnerabilities he hadn't known he possessed. The pressure had gotten to him, not the physical demands, which were challenging but manageable, but the psychological stress of being constantly tested, constantly evaluated, constantly pushed beyond what he thought he could handle. Kowalski, who'd been confident about his ability to handle anything the Navy could throw at him, had discovered that his confidence was based more on wishful thinking than actual capability. The combination of sleep deprivation and constant pressure had caused him to make a series of mistakes that could have been dangerous in real-world situations, and he'd requested a transfer to a different service branch that might be a better fit for his personality and skills. Other recruits were hanging on by threads, their performance declining as the week progressed and the accumulated stress took its toll. Johnson, who'd been so confident about his own superiority over Sarah, was barely keeping his eyes open during lectures and practical exercises. The stress was affecting his coordination, his decision-making, and his ability to work effectively with others. Rodriguez was becoming increasingly short-tempered, snapping at anyone who came near him and making mistakes that could have been dangerous in real-world situations. His usual aggressive confidence was being replaced by a defensive irritability that made him difficult to work with and potentially dangerous to be around. Thompson was second-guessing every decision, paralyzed by the fear of making errors that would draw negative attention from the instructors. His rural background had given him practical skills that should have been advantages, but his growing anxiety was preventing him from using those skills effectively. Martinez was pushing himself so hard physically that he was risking injury, trying to compensate for his growing anxiety by working harder rather than smarter. His immigrant family's sacrifices had given him powerful motivation, but that motivation was becoming counterproductive as he drove himself toward exhaustion. Wilson was becoming increasingly isolated, convinced that everyone was watching him for signs of weakness and responding by withdrawing from the team interactions that were essential for success in military operations. His military family background had given him theoretical knowledge, but it hadn't prepared him for the reality of sustained pressure. Davis was making increasingly desperate attempts to prove himself, taking unnecessary risks and making increasingly poor decisions as his confidence eroded. His need to be seen as competent was leading him to attempt things beyond his current skill level. And somehow, Sarah seemed to be getting stronger. While other recruits were struggling with sleep deprivation, she remained alert and focused during lectures and practical exercises. Her note-taking was as detailed as ever, her questions as insightful, her performance as consistent. While others were cracking under the constant pressure and evaluation, she maintained the same steady composure she'd shown from day one. While others were making mistakes born of exhaustion and stress, her performance remained consistently excellent. She completed every task efficiently and thoroughly, met every challenge with the same calm determination, and continued to exceed standards even as those around her struggled to meet basic requirements. It was driving everyone crazy. The recruits couldn't understand why their harassment wasn't having the effect they'd expected. They'd assumed that the combination of official pressure from Williams and unofficial hostility from their peers would eventually break her down, would force her to either fight back in ways that would justify their treatment of her or give up and leave the program. Instead, she seemed almost immune to their efforts, continuing to perform at a high level despite everything they were throwing at her. Her composure under pressure was becoming a source of frustration rather than respect, as if her ability to handle stress was somehow an unfair advantage rather than exactly the kind of quality the Navy was looking for in its personnel. Williams couldn't understand why his pressure tactics weren't having their usual effect. He'd been breaking down overconfident recruits for years, using a combination of impossible standards and constant criticism to separate those who had genuine commitment from those who were just playing at being military. His methods worked because they exposed people's true character under pressure, revealing whether they had the mental toughness required for naval service. But Sarah wasn't responding like other recruits. She wasn't becoming defensive or argumentative when criticized. She wasn't making increasingly desperate attempts to prove herself when faced with impossible standards. She wasn't showing signs of stress or exhaustion or doubt that would indicate the pressure was having its intended effect. She was just continuing to do the work, day after day, with the same quiet competence she'd displayed from the beginning. Her performance was so consistent that it almost seemed mechanical, as if she was operating according to some internal program that couldn't be disrupted by external pressure. Even I was starting to wonder what made this woman so different from every other recruit who'd been through this program. In over 2 decades of military service, I'd seen every type of person imaginable. I'd seen natural leaders and natural followers, introverts and extroverts, people from every background and walk of life imaginable. I'd seen people who seemed perfectly suited for military life wash out in the first week, and people who seemed completely unsuited for it go on to distinguished careers. But I'd never seen anyone respond to sustained pressure and harassment the way Sarah Mitchell was responding. There was something almost surreal about watching her endure treatment that would have broken most people while continuing to excel at every task she was given. It was like she was operating from a completely different playbook, following rules and principles that no one else understood. Her behavior suggested either an unusual degree of emotional maturity and self-control, or knowledge and experience that went far beyond what her background was supposed to include. The answer to that mystery would come soon enough, in a way that none of us could have predicted, and that would change everything everyone thought they knew about Sarah Mitchell and about the dangers of judging people based on appearances and assumptions. On day 4 of Hell Week, we were running night navigation exercises aboard the USS Leviathan, one of the older training vessels in the Norfolk Fleet. The Leviathan wasn't the most modern ship in the Navy. She'd been commissioned in the early 1980s during the Reagan buildup and had been converted to training use after decades of active service in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. But she was perfect for teaching recruits the basics of shipboard operations, with systems that were complex enough to be challenging, but simple enough to be understood by people who were still learning the fundamentals of naval service. The ship was a Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigate, originally designed for escort duty and anti-submarine warfare. At 453 feet long and displacing over 4,000 tons, she was large enough to provide realistic training in the kind of complex operations that characterize modern naval service, but small enough that recruits could understand how all the different systems worked together. Her bridge was equipped with navigation radar, GPS systems, and communication equipment that represented the standard technology of modern naval operations. Her engine room contained gas turbine propulsion systems that were similar to those used throughout the fleet. Her various compartments provided opportunities for training in damage control, emergency procedures, and the kind of teamwork that was essential for safe and effective naval operations. The exercise was designed to simulate real-world conditions as much as possible. The recruits would be divided into teams and assigned to different ship systems: navigation, communications, engine room operations, damage control, and general shipboard duties. They would have to work together to complete a series of increasingly complex scenarios that tested not just their individual knowledge and skills, but their ability to function as part of a larger team where everyone's performance affected everyone else's success. The night was clear and calm, with excellent visibility and moderate seas that provided ideal conditions for training. The recruits had been briefed on their assignments and were moving through the ship with the careful efficiency of people who were still learning their way around but were beginning to develop confidence in their abilities. Sarah had been assigned to the navigation team, working with the ship's electronic systems to plot courses and monitor the vessel's position relative to other ships and navigational hazards. It was a responsible assignment that required both technical knowledge and careful attention to detail. Exactly the kind of task that would reveal whether someone had the skills and temperament required for naval service. I was in the command center, monitoring the exercise through a combination of direct observation and electronic systems that allowed us to track the recruits' progress in real time. Everything was going smoothly, exactly according to plan, with the recruits performing their assigned tasks competently and working together effectively. Then, at 0347 hours, everything went wrong all at once. The first alarm was engine room temperature alert, not unusual by itself, since older ships had quirks and minor issues that required constant attention. Ships like the Leviathan, with decades of service and countless hours of operation, developed personalities of their own, with systems that needed to be coaxed and maintained by people who understood their particular characteristics. But then another alarm joined it: hydraulic pressure loss in the steering system, then another alarm indicating problems with the electrical distribution system. Then the big one: a catastrophic failure indicator in the main propulsion system that immediately triggered emergency protocols throughout the ship. Within minutes, we had a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anything that should have been possible during a routine training exercise. The Leviathan was showing signs of multiple system failures that were cascading through her electrical and mechanical systems like a virus spreading through a computer network. The ship was losing power in non-critical systems as the electrical distribution system tried to protect essential functions. She was losing maneuverability as the steering system struggled with hydraulic pressure that was dropping for reasons that weren't immediately apparent. Most seriously, she was developing a noticeable list to starboard as ballast systems failed to maintain proper trim, suggesting that the problems were affecting the fundamental systems that kept the ship stable and seaworthy. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Leviathan was an old ship, certainly, but she was maintained specifically for training purposes, according to standards that were even more rigorous than those applied to active duty vessels. Her systems were checked and double-checked on a regular basis, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of scenario. Regular maintenance schedules ensured that every component was inspected and replaced before it could fail. Constant monitoring systems provided early warning of potential problems before they could become serious. Conservative operating procedures limited the stress placed on aging systems to ensure they remained reliable. Now we had 37 recruits and a full crew aboard a vessel that was showing all the warning signs of a ship in serious trouble. The emergency protocols were clear. Evacuate non-essential personnel to safe areas, assess the extent of the damage, and if necessary, call for assistance from other vessels or shore-based emergency services. But the weather was beginning to deteriorate, with increasing winds and seas that would make any rescue operation increasingly dangerous and complex. The nearest ships with the capability to provide assistance were hours away, and even they might not be able to help if conditions continued to worsen. The next few hours would reveal just how wrong we'd all been about Sarah Mitchell, and would demonstrate that sometimes the people we're most inclined to dismiss are exactly the people we most need when things go seriously wrong. But here's the thing that will completely change how you think about judging people by their appearance. The woman that everyone had dismissed as just another pretty face was about to demonstrate knowledge and skills that would save every single person on that ship. The recruits who had spent weeks mocking her as someone who didn't belong were about to discover that she possessed expertise that surpassed not just their own limited experience, but the knowledge and capabilities of most of the officers on the base. If you want to find out how this story ends and discover the shocking truth about who Sarah Mitchell really was, you need to stay with me until the very end. Because what she did next didn't just surprise everyone on that ship. It revealed a background so impressive and unexpected that it would make every single person who had mocked her feel ashamed of their assumptions and deeply grateful for her presence when their lives depended on her expertise. The emergency alarms were now constant throughout the ship, creating a nerve-wracking wail that seemed to penetrate every corner of the vessel and made it impossible to think clearly about anything except the growing crisis. The sound was designed to be impossible to ignore, a mechanical scream that announced to everyone aboard that this was no longer a training exercise, but a genuine emergency that threatened the safety of everyone on board. The alarms weren't just noise. They were a complex communication system that told experienced sailors exactly which systems were failing and how serious the problems were becoming. The pattern of tones, the frequency of repetition, and the specific combinations of sounds all carried information about the nature and severity of the crisis that was unfolding. Chief Williams was on the radio with Norfolk Naval Base, his usually commanding tone replaced by something approaching controlled panic as he reported the cascade of system failures that were affecting every major operational system on the ship. The base was scrambling to provide assistance, coordinating with the Coast Guard and nearby vessels to prepare for a potential rescue operation, but the nearest ships with the capability to help were still hours away. The weather was beginning to deteriorate in ways that would make any rescue operation increasingly dangerous and complex. What had been calm seas and clear visibility were giving way to increasing winds and choppy waters that would challenge even experienced crews operating modern equipment. The ship's regular crew was doing everything they could to assess and control the situation, following emergency procedures that had been drilled into them through years of training and experience. Chief Engineer Hayes was deep in the engine compartments with his team, trying to diagnose problems that seemed to be multiplying faster than they could identify them. The damage control teams were working frantically to isolate failed systems and prevent the cascade from spreading to critical life support functions. They were sealing off compartments that showed signs of flooding, rerouting electrical systems around failed components, and trying to maintain essential services while dealing with failures that seemed to be affecting every major system on the ship. The navigation crew was plotting emergency courses to the nearest safe harbor while trying to compensate for steering systems that were becoming increasingly unreliable and unpredictable. They were also coordinating with other vessels in the area, ensuring that everyone knew about the Leviathan situation and was prepared to provide assistance if needed. And the recruits, most of them were following emergency protocols they'd only learned in theory, gathering in designated safe areas and staying out of the way while the professional crew dealt with the crisis. They were watching their training exercise transform into something that felt increasingly real and dangerous, and many of them were beginning to understand for the first time that military service involved genuine risks that went far beyond the controlled challenges of basic training. The reality of their situation was sinking in gradually. This wasn't a simulation or a test designed to challenge their problem-solving abilities. This was a real emergency aboard a real ship in real danger, with real consequences if the crew couldn't get the situation under control. Some of the recruits were handling the stress better than others. Thompson was staying calm and following instructions, his rural background having taught him the importance of staying focused during emergencies. Martinez was helping to organize other recruits and ensure that everyone was accounted for and in their assigned positions. But others were showing signs of the psychological pressure that emergency situations create. Johnson was pacing nervously, unable to sit still or focus on anything except the continuing alarms. Rodriguez was asking repeated questions about evacuation procedures, clearly worried about the possibility that they might need to abandon ship. Wilson was withdrawn and quiet, probably thinking about his military family's stories of naval disasters and the dangers that sailors faced in emergency situations. Davis was making nervous jokes that nobody found funny, his way of dealing with anxiety that was clearly building as the situation continued to deteriorate. All except Sarah. While the others waited for instructions or tried to stay out of the way of the crew's efforts, she had quietly made her way toward the engine compartments. Not to satisfy curiosity or to get in the way of the crew's emergency response, but with the focused, purposeful movement of someone who knew exactly where she was going and why she needed to be there. Her movement through the ship was different from the nervous pacing of other recruits or the purposeful but somewhat frantic activity of the regular crew. She moved with calm efficiency, as if she was following a mental map of the ship's layout that was more detailed and accurate than what basic training had provided. She paused at various points to observe the crew's activities, but not with the uncertain curiosity of someone trying to understand what was happening. Her observations were focused and analytical, as if she was assessing the effectiveness of the emergency response and looking for gaps or problems that others might have missed. Lieutenant Commander Hayes was the first person to notice her presence in the engineering spaces. He was standing over a complex diagnostic panel in the main engine room, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air of the compartment, trying to make sense of readouts that seemed to contradict each other with every passing minute. The instruments were showing failures in systems that should have been completely independent of each other, suggesting either a massive mechanical catastrophe that had somehow escaped detection during routine maintenance, or something more subtle and therefore potentially more dangerous, a systemic problem that was affecting multiple systems simultaneously. Hayes had 15 years of experience working on naval vessels, and he dealt with every type of mechanical and electrical failure imaginable. He'd seen engines break down in heavy seas, electrical systems fail during storms, and complex mechanical problems that required hours of careful diagnosis to understand and resolve. But he'd never seen anything quite like what the Leviathan was experiencing. The pattern of failures didn't match any of the scenarios he'd trained for or encountered during his career. The problems seemed to be affecting systems that should have been isolated from each other, creating a cascade effect that was spreading throughout the ship faster than his team could respond. "Recruit, you need to return to your designated area immediately," Hayes said without looking up from his instruments, his voice carrying the stress of someone who was dealing with more problems than he had solutions for. "This is not a drill anymore, and we need all non-essential personnel clear of engineering spaces so we can work without distractions." "Sir," Sarah said quietly, stepping closer to the diagnostic station despite his instruction to leave, "I think I know what's wrong." Hayes looked up then, his expression mixing irritation with disbelief. The idea that a recruit, particularly one who'd been in the Navy for less than 2 months and had no specialized training in ship systems, could diagnose a problem that was stumping experienced engineers was not just unlikely. It was almost insulting to the years of training and experience that he and his team brought to their work. "Recruit, I appreciate your willingness to help," Hayes said, forcing his voice to remain professional despite the stress of the situation and his growing frustration with problems that seemed to have no solution. "But what you think you know about complex ship systems couldn't possibly be relevant to what we're dealing with here." "The propulsion system failure isn't mechanical," Sarah interrupted, her voice calm but urgent, cutting through Hayes's dismissal with quiet authority that was completely at odds with her supposed status as an inexperienced recruit. "It's a cascade failure in the electronic control systems. The temperature spikes you're seeing aren't actual engine overheating. They're sensor malfunctions, causing the automated systems to make corrections for problems that don't actually exist." "Marisu." Hayes stared at her for a long moment, his hands frozen over the control panel as he tried to process what she had just said. Around them, the emergency alarms continued their insistent wailing, and the ship's list was becoming more pronounced as ballast systems struggled to compensate for the cascade of failures affecting every major system. This was not the time for theoretical discussions with recruits, no matter how confident they sounded or how much they seemed to understand about ship systems. Lives were potentially at stake, and every minute spent on distractions was a minute that could have been used to identify and solve the real problems that were threatening the ship. "Recruit Mitchell," Hayes said, forcing his voice to remain calm and professional despite his growing frustration. "Return to your designated area immediately. This is a direct order, and I don't have time to explain why it's important for you to follow it." "The hydraulic pressure loss is artificial," Sarah continued, stepping even closer to the diagnostic panel and pointing to specific readouts that Hayes had been struggling to interpret for the past hour. "Your instruments are showing system failures, but if you check the manual backup indicators over there, you'll find that the actual hydraulic pressure is well within normal parameters. The electronic control system is misreading sensor data and trying to compensate, which is creating real mechanical problems where none existed before." Something in her tone, in the specificity and technical accuracy of what she was saying, made Hayes pause in his attempt to order her away from the engineering spaces. This wasn't the desperate theorizing of someone trying to be helpful beyond their capabilities, throwing around technical terms they'd heard but didn't understand in hopes of being useful. This wasn't someone making wild guesses based on limited knowledge, hoping to stumble onto something that might be relevant. This was someone speaking with the confidence and precision of actual expertise, demonstrating understanding of ship systems that went far beyond what basic training provided. "How could you possibly know that?" Hayes asked, his voice carrying a mixture of skepticism and growing interest as he began to consider the possibility that she might actually understand what she was talking about. "Because I've seen this exact failure mode before," Sarah replied, her eyes scanning the diagnostic displays with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at and knew how to interpret the complex patterns of information they contained. "This is a classic cascade failure in the Mark 7 integrated control system," she continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with these systems professionally. "It usually starts with a corrupted data packet in the central processing unit, which causes sensor misreadings throughout the ship's electronic infrastructure, which triggers automatic corrections designed to address problems that don't actually exist, which creates actual physical problems in systems that were working perfectly before the cascade began." Hayes was staring at her now with an expression I'd never seen before in all my years of military service. 15 years of naval engineering experience was telling him that what this recruit was saying was impossible, that there was no way she could have the knowledge and experience necessary to diagnose such a complex and unusual failure mode. But everything she was describing matched exactly what he was seeing on his instruments, explaining anomalies and contradictions that had been baffling him and his team since the crisis began. Her explanation made sense of readings that had seemed impossible, providing a framework for understanding problems that had appeared to be random and unrelated. "Even if you're right," Hayes said slowly, his voice betraying his growing realization that she might actually know what she was talking about. "Fixing a cascade failure in the Mark 7 system requires detailed knowledge of the core programming architecture and the specific command sequences needed to reset the system without losing critical data. That's not something they teach in basic training," he continued, studying her face for signs that she understood the complexity of what she was suggesting. "That's not even something they teach to most naval engineers unless they've specialized in electronic systems integration and spent years working with these specific systems." "No," Sarah agreed, moving to the central control console with the confident efficiency of someone who had performed these actions many times before. "It's not." And then she did something that made every person in that engine room stop what they were doing and stare in absolute amazement. She began entering commands into the ship's central computer system with the speed and precision of someone who had intimate familiarity with every aspect of its operation. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating through layers of diagnostic menus and system interfaces that most naval engineers needed reference manuals to access. She moved through the ship's electronic architecture like she was walking through her own home, knowing exactly where everything was located and how all the different systems connected to each other. The commands she was entering were complex sequences that required knowledge of programming languages, system protocols, and security procedures that were closely guarded secrets of naval engineering. She was accessing subsystems that most people didn't even know existed, working with code that had been written by teams of specialists and was supposed to be impossible to modify without extensive training and authorization. Within minutes, she had isolated the corrupted data packet that was causing the cascade failure, a single line of bad code that was propagating through the ship's entire electronic infrastructure like a computer virus. She initiated a complete system reset that began bringing the ship's various systems back online, one by one, each success announced by the blessed silence of alarms that stopped wailing as their associated systems returned to normal operation. The engine room, which had been filled with the sounds of mechanical distress and human panic for hours, suddenly became almost eerily quiet as normal operations resumed throughout the ship. The emergency lighting switched back to regular illumination. The ship's list began to correct itself as ballast systems resumed proper function. The constant vibration of stressed machinery gave way to the steady, reassuring hum of systems operating within normal parameters. It was like watching a miracle unfold in real time. Systems that had been failing for hours suddenly began working perfectly. Alarms that had been screaming warnings about catastrophic failures fell silent. The ship that had been in danger of sinking or requiring emergency evacuation was suddenly stable and seaworthy again. "How?" Hayes whispered, his voice barely audible over the now normal sounds of ship operations. "How is this possible? Who are you?" Sarah straightened up from the control console, brushing a strand of hair away from her face, her calm demeanor unchanged despite having just performed what amounted to a technological miracle. For the first time since the crisis began, she looked directly at Hayes and the assembled crew members who were staring at her in stunned silence. The moment stretched out as everyone waited for her answer, the explanation that would make sense of what they had just witnessed. The woman who had been dismissed as an incompetent outsider had just demonstrated technical expertise that had saved their lives, and everyone wanted to understand how that was possible. "I spent 8 years as a civilian contractor specializing in naval engineering systems," Sarah said simply, her voice carrying none of the triumph or satisfaction that someone else might have shown after solving such a critical problem under pressure. "I have a master's degree in marine engineering from MIT, with specialized focus on integrated electronic systems and their failure modes." The silence in the engine room was so complete that you could hear the gentle hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of waves against the hull. Every person present, officers, enlisted personnel, and the few recruits who had witnessed what happened, was staring at this blonde woman who had just casually revealed that she possessed more technical expertise related to naval systems than anyone else on the ship. But Sarah wasn't finished with her revelations. "I've troubleshot this exact type of cascade failure on 3 different vessels," she continued, her tone remaining matter-of-fact, despite the explosive nature of what she was revealing, including a guided missile destroyer that experienced a similar problem during operations in the Persian Gulf, an aircraft carrier that had a Mark 7 failure during exercises in the Pacific, and a submarine that lost multiple systems due to corrupted code while on patrol in the North Atlantic. Hayes was shaking his head slowly, trying to process information that fundamentally challenged everything he thought he understood about the situation and about Sarah Mitchell herself. The scope of experience she was describing went far beyond what most naval engineers accumulated in entire careers. "I also hold certifications in advanced marine electronics, ship system integration, emergency damage control procedures, and naval architecture," she continued. "I've worked on everything from coastal patrol boats to nuclear aircraft carriers, specializing in the kind of complex system interactions that can cause exactly the type of cascade failure we just experienced." The implications of what she was saying were staggering. This wasn't just someone with theoretical knowledge or limited experience with naval systems. This was someone who had worked at the highest levels of naval engineering, dealing with the most advanced and complex systems in the fleet. "Then why?" Hayes asked, his voice filled with bewilderment and growing respect. "Are you here as a recruit? Why didn't you apply for an officer commission? Why are you going through basic training like someone with no experience instead of serving as a senior engineering specialist where your expertise would be immediately valuable to the Navy?" It was the question that everyone in the room was thinking, the obvious inconsistency that made no sense given what they had just learned about her background and qualifications. Someone with her credentials and experience should have been able to walk into the Navy with an immediate commission as a lieutenant or lieutenant commander, with responsibility for managing complex engineering projects and leading teams of specialists. Sarah's answer was simple, but it would haunt everyone who had mocked and dismissed her for the rest of their military careers. "Because I wanted to understand what it was really like to serve," she said, her voice carrying quiet conviction that made it clear this wasn't a decision she'd made lightly or without considering the costs it would involve. "I wanted to earn my place in the Navy the same way everyone else does, from the ground up, starting with the basics and proving myself through performance rather than credentials." She paused for a moment, looking around at the faces of the people who were listening to her explanation, seeing the mixture of amazement, respect, and shame that was beginning to replace the assumptions and prejudices they had carried for weeks. "I spent years working with naval systems as a civilian contractor," she continued, "but I never really understood what it meant to be a sailor. I knew how the technology worked. I understood the engineering principles. I could solve technical problems that stumped other people. But I didn't understand the culture, the commitment, the sacrifices that every person who wears this uniform makes." The room was completely silent as everyone absorbed the implications of what she was saying. This wasn't someone who had stumbled into military service because she had no other options. This wasn't someone who was using the Navy as a stepping stone to something else. This was someone who had deliberately chosen the hardest possible path to naval service because she wanted to earn her place through character and commitment rather than credentials and connections. "I wanted to prove that I belonged here not because of my education or my civilian experience," Sarah said, "but because I was willing to do the work and make the sacrifices that every person who serves their country makes. I wanted to understand what it really meant to be part of a team where everyone depends on everyone else, where your individual performance affects everyone else's safety and success." The implications of what she was saying hit everyone in the room simultaneously, like a wave breaking over their consciousness and washing away assumptions they'd held without questioning. This woman, who had endured weeks of harassment and humiliation without complaint, who had been dismissed as a diversity hire and mocked as someone who didn't belong, possessed qualifications that surpassed those of most officers on the base. She could have walked into the Navy with an officer's commission and immediate respect based on her credentials and experience. She could have started her service career in a position of authority and responsibility that would have spared her all the degradation and hostility she'd endured as a recruit. Instead, she had chosen to earn that respect through service, even knowing what it would cost her. She had chosen to be judged not on her impressive credentials, but on her character and her willingness to serve. And she had done so knowing that she would be misjudged, underestimated, and mistreated by people who couldn't see past their own prejudices and assumptions. The story of what had happened in the engine room spread through the ship like wildfire, growing and evolving, with each telling but maintaining its essential core. The woman everyone had dismissed as an incompetent outsider had just saved their lives using knowledge and skills that none of them had even known she possessed. As word of Sarah's background and what she'd accomplished spread through the ship, the atmosphere began to change in ways that were both subtle and profound. The story traveled from the engine room to the crew quarters, from the command center to the mess hall, carried by crew members and recruits who could barely believe what they had witnessed. The recruits who had been calling her princess and making jokes about her suitability for military service suddenly found themselves unable to meet her eyes when she passed them in the corridors. The casual cruelty that had characterized their interactions with her for weeks was replaced by an uncomfortable silence that spoke volumes about their growing realization of how wrong they had been. Johnson, who had led much of the harassment with his comments about Barbie playing dress-up, was seen sitting alone in the mess hall for hours, staring at his meal without eating, clearly struggling to process the gap between his assumptions and reality. The confident superiority he had displayed for weeks was gone, replaced by something that looked like shame and confusion. Rodriguez, who had confidently predicted that Sarah would wash out within a week or two, was avoiding the engine room entirely, unable to face the place where his worldview had been so thoroughly demolished. His usual aggressive demeanor was replaced by uncharacteristic quiet, as if he was afraid that speaking would reveal how little he actually understood about anything. Thompson, who had questioned whether people like her belonged in the military, was overheard asking other recruits whether they thought Sarah would accept an apology, and if so, how someone could possibly apologize for weeks of systematic harassment based on prejudices that had proven to be not just wrong, but spectacularly wrong. Martinez was dealing with his own crisis of understanding, trying to reconcile his assumptions about privilege and merit with the reality of Sarah's qualifications and her deliberate choice to earn her place through service rather than credentials. His family's immigrant experience had taught him to value hard work and earned achievement, but he was beginning to realize that his definition of those concepts had been too narrow. Wilson was probably thinking about his military family's values and wondering what they would think of his behavior towards someone who embodied the kind of service and sacrifice they had always talked about. His background should have taught him to recognize and respect genuine commitment to service, but his prejudices had blinded him to what was right in front of him. Davis was struggling with the realization that his need to establish dominance had led him to attack someone who was not only more qualified than he was, but who had deliberately chosen not to use those qualifications to avoid exactly the kind of treatment he had subjected her to. The training officers were having their own reckonings with the situation. These were experienced military professionals who prided themselves on their ability to assess personnel and identify potential problems or strengths in new recruits. The fact that they had all completely misjudged Sarah Mitchell raised uncomfortable questions about their own biases and the assumptions they brought to their evaluations. Chief Williams, who had spent weeks trying to break Sarah's spirit with impossible tasks and degrading assignments, approached her as she was completing routine maintenance work in one of the ship's technical compartments. For the first time since she'd arrived at the base, he seemed uncertain about how to interact with her. The man who had been so confident in his ability to identify and eliminate unsuitable recruits was now facing the reality that he had been systematically harassing someone whose qualifications and commitment far exceeded his own. The impossible standards and constant criticism that he had used to try to break her down had revealed not her weaknesses, but his own prejudices and limitations as a leader. "Mitchell," he said, his voice lacking its usual authoritative bark and carrying instead a tone that was almost tentative, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to address her at all. "Yes, Chief Petty Officer," Sarah replied, looking up from the equipment she was checking, her expression as calm and professional as it had always been. There was no triumph in her voice, no satisfaction at his obvious discomfort, just the same steady respect for the chain of command that she had maintained throughout all the harassment. "Why didn't you tell us?" Williams asked, the question carrying the weight of someone who was fundamentally questioning his own judgment and everything he thought he knew about leadership and evaluation. "Why didn't you defend yourself when we were treating you the way we did? You could have stopped all of it just by explaining your background and qualifications." Sarah looked at him with those same steady eyes that had never wavered, even during the worst of the harassment and impossible standards he had imposed on her. There was no anger in her expression, no resentment for the weeks of unfair treatment, just a calm understanding that seemed to see past his actions to the insecurities and assumptions that had motivated them. "Because proving my worth through words wouldn't have meant anything, Chief," she said simply. "Anyone can claim to have knowledge and experience. Anyone can wave around degrees and certifications and demand respect based on credentials. I needed to prove that I could do the job when it mattered, that I could perform under pressure, that I belonged here regardless of what anyone else thought about my qualifications or background. But the way we treated you," Williams began, his voice trailing off as he struggled to find words for the magnitude of the injustice that had been done. The impossible standards, the constant criticism, the systematic attempt to break her spirit, all of it had been based on assumptions that had proven to be completely wrong. "You treated me exactly the way you treat every recruit who doesn't fit your expectations," Sarah replied, her tone carrying no accusation or bitterness, just a simple statement of fact that was probably more devastating than any angry confrontation could have been. "The only difference is that I knew I belonged here, so your opinion of me couldn't change that fundamental truth." Williams stood there for a long moment, looking like a man who was reassessing everything he thought he knew about leadership, about judgment, about what it really meant to serve in the military. The realization that he had been systematically harassing someone whose qualifications far exceeded his own was clearly weighing heavily on him. But more than that, he was grappling with the understanding that Sarah's response to his harassment had revealed more about her character and suitability for military service than any of the standards or tests he had used to evaluate other recruits. Her ability to maintain her composure and continue performing at a high level while being treated unfairly was exactly the kind of quality the Navy needed in its personnel. "I owe you an apology," William said finally, his voice carrying genuine regret and a newfound respect that was obvious to everyone who heard it. "We all do. What we did was wrong, and there's no excuse for it." "No," Sarah said quietly, returning her attention to the equipment she was maintaining. "You don't owe me an apology. You owe it to yourself to learn from this experience. And you owe it to future recruits to remember that appearances can be deceiving, that people's worth isn't determined by how well they fit your expectations, and that the qualities that make someone a good sailor aren't always visible on the surface." The rest of Hell Week continued, but everything was different now. The dynamic between Sarah and the other recruits had fundamentally shifted, not because she was behaving differently. She continued to perform her duties with the same quiet competence she had always shown, but because they were finally seeing her clearly for the first time. Some of the recruits tried to apologize, offering awkward explanations for their behavior that Sarah accepted with the same grace she had shown everything else. They spoke about peer pressure, about wanting to fit in, about not understanding who she really was, as if any of those things excused weeks of deliberate cruelty towards someone who had done nothing to deserve their hostility. Thompson approached her after a training session, his face red with embarrassment and shame. Mitchell, I wanted to say that I'm sorry for the way I treated you. I was wrong about you, about everything. I don't know how to make up for what I did." "Oh, you don't need to make up for anything," Sarah replied calmly. "You just need to remember this experience the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on assumptions rather than evidence." Martinez tried to explain his behavior by talking about his family's struggles and his belief that military service should be earned through hardship. Sarah listened patiently and then said simply, "Hardship takes many forms. The fact that mine was different from yours doesn't make it less real or less valuable." Others, like Johnson and Rodriguez, seemed unable to process what had happened. They had invested so much of their identity in the belief that they were superior to this woman, that accepting the truth would require them to fundamentally change how they saw themselves and the world around them. Rather than confront that uncomfortable reality, they withdrew into sullen silence, avoiding Sarah entirely rather than deal with the cognitive dissonance her presence created. They couldn't reconcile their image of themselves as deserving military personnel with the reality that they had been systematically harassing someone who was far more qualified and committed than they were. But the most profound change was in how everyone viewed the very concept of judgment based on appearance, background, or assumptions about what kind of person belonged in the military. In the days that followed, as the story of what happened on the USS Leviathan spread throughout Norfolk Naval Base, it became more than just an anecdote about one recruit's unexpected expertise. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice, about the courage required to let your actions speak louder than your credentials, about the difference between earning respect and demanding it. The story was told and retold in barracks and mess halls, in training classrooms and aboard ships throughout the fleet. Each telling emphasized different aspects of what had happened, but they all carried the same essential message. You never know who the person next to you really is, what they're capable of, or what they've sacrificed to be there. Sarah Mitchell completed her basic training with honors, of course. Her performance throughout the program had been exemplary from the beginning, but now everyone could see what had been obvious all along to anyone who was actually paying attention. Her final evaluations reflected not just her technical competence and physical fitness, but the kind of character and leadership potential that the Navy desperately needed. But more importantly, she had accomplished something far more significant than earning a military rank or completing a training program. She had demonstrated that true strength isn't about proving you're better than everyone else. It's about being willing to be underestimated, to be dismissed, to be mocked, and still continuing to do the right thing because you know who you are and what you're capable of. The woman who had saved the USS Leviathan and everyone aboard her had also saved something else that night. The possibility that people could change, could learn, could grow beyond their prejudices and assumptions to see others more clearly and judge them more fairly. When I think about that night and everything that followed, I'm struck by a simple but powerful truth. Sarah Mitchell didn't reveal her background to prove she was better than anyone else, or to shame the people who had mistreated her, or to gain some kind of personal vindication for the harassment she had endured. She revealed it because circumstances demanded that she use her knowledge and skills to protect people who had treated her terribly. Even her moment of vindication was an act of service, an example of the kind of character that puts duty above personal satisfaction and the welfare of others above personal grievances. Years later, some of those recruits would go on to become outstanding sailors themselves, carrying with them the lesson they learned about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize true worth and potential. They would tell the story of Sarah Mitchell to their own subordinates, passing on the understanding that respect must be earned through performance and character rather than assumed based on rank or appearance. Others would struggle with the memory of their behavior, using it as motivation to become better people and better leaders. They would remember how wrong they had been about someone they had dismissed so easily, and they would be more careful about judging others based on limited information and unfounded assumptions. Chief Williams would go on to become one of the most effective training officers in the Navy, largely because he never forgot the lesson Sarah Mitchell taught him about the difference between leadership based on intimidation and leadership based on genuine understanding of human potential. He would change his methods, focusing on identifying and developing the unique strengths that each recruit brought to military service, rather than trying to force everyone into the same narrow mold. And Sarah? She completed her enlisted service with distinction, earning commendations for her technical expertise and her leadership abilities. She was eventually offered an officer's commission and went on to become one of the Navy's leading experts in electronic systems integration, responsible for training other engineers and developing new technologies that would improve the safety and effectiveness of naval operations. But she never forgot the experience of earning her place through service rather than credentials, and she made sure that every sailor under her command understood that respect was something to be earned through character and competence, not assumed based on rank or background. She created an environment where people were judged by their actions and their commitment to the mission, not by their appearance or the assumptions others made about their capabilities. The principles she demonstrated during those difficult weeks at Norfolk became the foundation of her leadership philosophy. That true strength comes from service to others, that respect must be earned rather than demanded, and that the most important qualities of military personnel are often invisible until they're tested under pressure. That's the kind of person the Navy needs. That's the kind of person the world needs. People who are willing to be underestimated and misunderstood while quietly doing the work that needs to be done. People who measure their worth by their service to others rather than by the recognition they receive. People who understand that true leadership means putting the welfare of others above personal comfort or convenience. And if this story makes you think twice before you judge someone based on how they look, or where you think they come from, or what you assume they're capable of, then maybe Sarah Mitchell's courage accomplished something even more important than saving a ship and the people aboard it. Maybe it helped save us from our own prejudices, our own narrow thinking, our own failure to see the potential in people who don't match our expectations or fit our preconceived notions of what success looks like. Because the truth is, we're all surrounded by people whose true capabilities and character we don't fully understand. We're all guilty of making assumptions based on limited information, of judging others by standards we don't apply to ourselves, of missing opportunities to learn from people who have experiences and knowledge that could benefit us all. Sarah Mitchell's story isn't just about one woman's courage in the face of unfair treatment. It's about the courage required to see past our own biases, to question our own assumptions, to remain open to the possibility that the people we're most tempted to dismiss might be exactly the people we most need to learn from. In a world that often seems divided by prejudice and misunderstanding, by the tendency to judge others based on surface appearances rather than deeper truths, Sarah's example reminds us that real strength comes from service, that true worth is demonstrated through actions rather than words, and that the most important qualities in any person are often invisible until they're tested under pressure. Her story challenges us to be better, to look beyond our assumptions, to question our prejudices, to remain open to the possibility that everyone we meet has something valuable to teach us if we're willing to listen and learn. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all, that the person you're most inclined to dismiss, the one who doesn't fit your expectations or match your assumptions about what success looks like, might be exactly the person you most need when things get difficult and you need someone with the knowledge, skills, and character to help you through. What do you think about this story? Have you ever found yourself making assumptions about someone that turned out to be completely wrong? Have you ever been in a situation where you were judged unfairly based on how you looked or what people thought they knew about you? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts about how we can all do better at seeing past surface appearances to recognize the true potential in the people around us. And if you enjoyed this incredible true story about how appearances can deceive and how true character reveals itself in moments of crisis, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories that will challenge everything you think you know about human nature and the power of perseverance in the face of adversity. There's another fascinating story coming next week about a janitor who everyone ignored and overlooked until the day he saved an entire Fortune 500 company from bankruptcy using knowledge and insights that nobody knew he had. It's another powerful reminder that we should never underestimate people based on their job title, their appearance, or our assumptions about their background. You won't want to miss it. It will change how you think about the people you encounter every day who might be capable of far more than anyone realizes.